Author J. Wurts was told the dramatic life story of Layli Hayslip. The book, When Heaven and Earth Changed Places, was selected by International Pen as one of the best 25 books of 1989. Jay, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Describe, Jay, for us your initial meeting with Layli Hayslip and how you felt perhaps that you could enhance her dramatic life story.
Well, I met Lee initially in 1984 at a writers' conference, University of California in San Diego, and we were introduced by a mutual acquaintance who was a woman who was a mystery writer, and she said, there's an Oriental woman here who is looking for a co-author, and that's what you do, and I said yes. And we were introduced, and I remember thinking at the time it's going to be a cookbook or something like that, and which I really didn't have much experience with, and certainly it's very attractive, well-dressed Vietnamese lady was introduced to me, and she says in a very small voice, I have the story, which I've talked to other people. Now, I will tell you about it, but if at any time you feel disturbed by it or you'd like to walk away, please feel free to do it. Not everyone likes it. I'm thinking this has got to be a strange cookbook. And so she went ahead and told me the short version of the story of her life, which was one of the most remarkable stories I'd heard.
What were the conditions that she described to you, and can you overview the book for us to share with us what she had to endure in Vietnam?
Well, actually, and you had mentioned Oliver Stone. I think he put it well in one interview that she had experienced this whole wheel of life. She was born after World War II, went through as a very small child the war with the French, with experiences with her family and the extended family, which is very common in the Vietnamese culture. Her own experiences as a teenager being dragooned into the Viet Cong, which was very dominant in the area of central Vietnam, just south of Da Nang, where her village was. And you have to remember, this is a peasant family. It's not one of the well-educated people living in the city. So they were very much sensitive to the pulse of the war, things that were going on in the countryside. She was one of the many child helpers who dressed wounds for the wounded Viet Cong.
Wasn't her village entirely destroyed?
It was destroyed in bits and pieces for years and years. I believe there was one rather climactic battle in which 2/3 of it was pretty much razed.
There was an expression you used once, I heard you say, how the survivors survive. And how did Layli Hayslip survive? Was her Buddhist faith in any way something that she could lean on? It sounds like she faced so much tragedy.
It was, but that almost becomes a cliche, because I think many people who are religious turn to that in times of turmoil. One of the attractions to me in her story was, how do survivors survive? What are the things that go into the more practical aspects of it? One example, which is also depicted in the first book, is her return to Vietnam in 1986. She was one of the first Vietnamese expatriates to actually return to the country to find out what had happened to her family. The fact that she is very circumspect about approaching a situation, whereas we Americans might blunder into something hoping to get it over with, perhaps. One of the survival skills seems to be keeping your mouth shut and being very observant, and then following your lead from there.
When you met Layli Hayslip, how was her language? How did you have to translate her language into a book that you felt the American public could easily digest?
Well, she did that very easily for me, in that she had a rough manuscript in English. Her first husband, or her second husband, did not like the idea of her wanting to get her life experiences onto paper. So she wrote in longhand in Vietnamese secretly, so that if it was ever discovered, she could say she was writing letters to her family. When her husband passed away, she then worked with her son Jim, who was a college student at the time, dictating what is basically her oral history.
She dictated to Jim in English then?
To Jim, well, yes, in English. And she got basically a very rough oral history, which was everything she could remember about her mother, everything she remembered about her father and her sister Ba, her sister Hai. And it was my task as her collaborator to weave these into a single story.
I wrote a quote that I think you said something similar about Oliver Stone, that he seems to feel the long-suffering soul of the Vietnamese people. Did you feel that that was true and part of the reason he was attracted to this story?
Well, I think Oliver feels that, but I also think he feels the suffering of Oliver Stone's soul to a degree, and I think that's what motivates him in many of the works that he's done. We had talked earlier about the therapeutic aspect simply of writing books, or someone in Lee's position who is telling their story to someone else who will be putting it into first-person form for them. there is a very dynamic and therapeutic aspect to putting your story. One thing, it requires you to sit down and figure it out, which a lot of people don't do. All the feelings are there, but they don't know quite why they're there. So that's part of what Oliver Stone does in his films very, very well, very artistically. He is a great artist by no question.
I really want to have a chance to talk to you about your process. This isn't the only book that you have co-written, but this is one of the award-winning books, and it is a best-selling book, I know, in China.
South China Post.
The South China Post. And of course, it's going to receive quite a bit of attention when the film comes out. Will you speak to the point of how you selected the incidents that Layli had already written down, and how you put them in a sequential order and built transitions between them to make such a smooth book?
Well, I think the task of any book is finding the dramatic arc. I think any story can be is really only as good as the characters in it. And I think that was one of the appeals of the book, and one of the I guess areas of craft that an as told to co-author can bring to a project like that, is finding those characters which have the most dramatic content, stringing them together in such a way that you feel compelled to turn the page to find out what's going to happen next. That's not so much inventing things to put into the book as it is prospecting for the inherent drama and conflict that's in the situation, and certainly her life has been full of both.
So character. And so when you saw certain characters, did you ask Layli perhaps to add, to expound on them?
Without question, right. In fact, one of the strongest characters in the book is her mother. Oliver tends to describe, and I don't know the approach he's taking in the film, but it is not so much a woman's story as it is a profound human story, and that certainly is true. But I think one of the challenges and attractions to someone like Oliver, and certainly was as a male writer, you get a chance to live for a while in this female incarnation and experience the things which not only had I not experienced, but things which can only be experienced, I think, from a woman's perspective. So it's a stretch, I think, from other types of projects. And again, in terms of strong characters, the women characters on her side of the family, but also the ones that she established the rapport with on the American side of her story, which is talked about in the second book, were quite profound, quite interesting.
So it sounds like you stitched together the key characters, and you had an opportunity to perhaps even interview Layli and build on those characters to form that arc of your story.
Sure, sure. We worked very closely in not only taking what she had put down in her oral history, but expanding it where necessary. A lot of this gets into the craft of writing and scene building, but as I'm sure you know as a writer yourself, out of a particular encounter, we might describe what's going on in the studio right now. There's 100 or 200 things we could probably mention, but only 3 or 4 would be relevant to actually conveying the story, including the sense of our emotions at the time and what's going on, as well as the dialogue.
So the highlights, the highlighting that you picked and the scene details. Let's speak for a moment about your other projects. I know you've done a book on Richard Secord.
That's right, with Richard Secord, another first-person book. 2 people who are really night and day. Interestingly enough, they're both warriors, different types. But yes, Dick Secord was was a tough hombre. The image you get of him in the media certainly is representative of the kind of person he is. He was once accused of being the only person who sits at attention in a chair. But in fact, I will say something on your show, which I don't think I've mentioned anywhere else, is that, and it would be interesting to know if any of the readers who have encountered the book agree, but when I first, again, resonating to the Lee Hayslip story, first talked to Dick about the other aspects of his life, of his autobiography, an image came to mind from my early childhood, which was this great John Ford Western, The Searchers. And a lot of his experiences seemed to tie in very closely to the John Wayne character in that story, almost to an eerie degree. When actually we had talked through his life experiences, you can almost lay them out. The character in the John Ford Western was an ex-Civil War soldier. He was rather alienated with society and culture. It's how he deals with his life in this new post-war era, and certainly Dick Secord, as the consummate covert Cold War warrior, was faced with many of the same challenges.
Thanks so much for sharing with us your work with Layli Hayslip, When Heaven and Earth Change Places.